Okay, so there's this one tool that we don't use nearly as much as we could or should in Lightroom, and if you use it correctly, there's so many cool things you can do with it. But more often than not, it's just a case of not really knowing what's a good use for it. And today I'm going to be teaching you all the things that I know about the brush tool and how it's a game changer in Lightroom. Does that sound good? Roll the intro. What's up team, my name is Mark and welcome back to Making Instagram Bangers, the series where I teach you all the tips and tricks that I use to shoot and edit my photos. So today I'm going to be teaching you 9 tricks that I use on a regular basis using the brush tool. 9 different creative ways to use the brush tool to dramatically enhance your photography and allow you to do so many cool things that you didn't think you could do straight in Lightroom. Now, a lot of these you could do in Photoshop and you'd have a little bit more control, but this is just a quick and dirty way that you can do straight in Lightroom, and it just makes your life a lot easier than having to send it to Photoshop, bring it back. If you want full control, you can go in Photoshop, but for small adjustments and a bunch of different tricks, it is really, really useful. So without further ado, let's jump into Lightroom for tip number 1, and that is changing colors. All right. Okay, so I have covered this technique in depth in another tutorial, but let's just get a quick and easy version of it. So if I zoom in on this boat, I'm just going to grab the brush tool and holding down the command key, I'm just slowly going to brush over this boat right here, making sure to get all the areas that are red. That's the part I want to change color. So I'm just going to brush over all of these areas. There we go, let's cover all of that quite nicely. Holding down the command key or the alt key on Windows means Lightroom is now looking for edges. So it means you can brush with a little bit more precision than if you were just trying to eyeball it. So let's brush over all of these areas here. Lightroom is doing a really good job of detecting what's red and what isn't and finding those edges. There we go, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to reset the exposure, bring the saturation down, all the way down. There we go, now we can see some of the areas where Lightroom hasn't quite picked up on those edges. So we can just fine tune that a little bit. Make sure to brush. There we go. Okay, so now that we've got that brushed out nicely, I can now apply my own color. So let's make this boat blue. And there we go, all green either way. There we go, easy as. And if I zoom out, perfect. Super easy brush trick right there. Now you could zoom in and fine tune it a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, that works really, really well. Tip number 2, painting water. So this is really good for sort of landscape shots where you want this sort of mystical, beautiful vibe going on, but maybe the water's a little bit murky or something like that. Well, you can correct that quite easily. So all we're gonna do here is just slowly brush over the river here. There we go, brush over all of that. The beauty is with this one, you don't have to be that precise. You can just eyeball it and then fine tune it afterwards. Got to bring the exposure down. And for this one, I'm just going to bring the temperature down. Let's bring it down to -50. Now, as you can see, this is a little bit extreme. So what I'm going to do is just bring the saturation down as well. Somewhere around -60 or something. That should look pretty good. There we go, that already looks pretty nice. So now I can fine tune it and paint around some of these edges that I didn't quite get right the first time. And there we go, that already looks really, really nice. And that's really changed the vibe and atmosphere of this photo. It looks so much better now. Now you could tweak it a little bit and maybe pull the saturation down slightly further just to, make it a little bit more subtle. But again, that's just playing with the settings and finding out what works best for you. Tip number 3, lighting up lamps. Okay, so for this one here, what I'm going to do is grab my brush tool yet again, and I'm just going to put some dots on all of these lamps right here. There we go, one at a time, and just slowly make my way around all of these lamps. I can make the brush a little bit smaller for some of these smaller ones. There we go, and make it a little bit bigger for some of these bigger lamps. I want them to be nice and bright. Okay, now they're all lit up, let's play with the settings a little bit. So I'm going to drop down the exposure because that's way too high. I might push it up to sort of 1-ish, something like that. Now the issue is when you light up lamps using this technique, it does tend to blow things out a little bit. So to fix this, I like to push the contrast up a little bit, maybe 35, something like that. It brings back a little bit of contrast, a little bit of a little bit of shadows that you'd lost. And then same thing, I might bring the warmth up just a little bit, just to get that warm, nice glow from these lamps. And maybe push the tint up a little bit as well. And there you go, that looks so much brighter, so much more vibrant, and this really shows you how powerful a trick this is. From just a tiny adjustment, just using the brush, it's really brought this photo to life. Tip number 4, adding light rays and direction to an image. Okay, so this one here is a bit of a cheeky hack, but it does really add a sense of direction and really emphasizes that sunlight you're getting in the image. So what I'm going to do is grab my brush tool once again, and I'm just going to go from one corner where the light is coming from and just add some big lines all the way across the image like this, as if they were sun rays coming from the corner of the image. Now this is way too bright, so what I'm going to do is reset the exposure and just bump it up a couple of notches ever so slightly, and pull the contrast up a little bit as well. As I mentioned earlier, this allows you to bring back some contrast and not have it too overblown. And there we go, we've added some quite subtle light rays from the corner of the image. You don't really see them when you look at them like this, but if I turn the effect off and on again, you can really see the difference that it makes. It really pulls in that direction from the corner straight onto that tree, and it makes it such a better composition. Tip number 5, adding contrast to your landscape shots. Okay, so this is an awesome trick when you've got a landscape and it's got some areas that are quite bright and some areas that are quite dark. So for this one here, I really want to add a little bit of light around these top areas, but I don't want them to be anywhere else, just to focus the attention on those bright areas. Now you could do this with the luminance panel, but the brush tool works just as well. So I'm just going to brush over some of these areas that I want to brighten. There we go, something like that. This really doesn't have to be too precise, it's all about adding a subtle amount of light to your image. I'm going to bring the exposure back down. I'm just going to push the exposure up just a little bit, just so you can see it. There we go, maybe less than that. And again, I'm just going to push the contrast up a bit as well, just so that this area doesn't look too overblown. And there we go, it's really subtle, but it does enhance the image. And you can play around with this as well. You could add darker areas on other parts of the mountain, or highlight some other areas that you think need to be highlighted. Tip number 6, sharpening specific areas. Now this is a tip that works really well when you've got a subject that's right in the center, or something that you really want to focus the attention on. So again, I'm going to grab my brush tool, and I want this monkey to really be the center of attention. So what I'm going to do is just slowly brush over this monkey. I don't even need to be too precise, just brush over him. I'm just going to brush around all of these edges. There we go, now that's brushed out. Again, I'm going to reset the exposure, bring it back down. And I'm going to bring the sharpness all the way up, and also add a little bit of clarity, because clarity sometimes helps with sharpness. There we go, not too much. Let's bring it up to, say, 28 or 30, something like that should be fine. And there we go, that looks so much sharper, and it's got a lot more contrast to it. This is really, really vibrant now. If we look at the before and after, this has made a huge difference, and it really looks much sharper, much stronger now. It's a much more striking look. Now again, you want to be careful with this to not go overboard, so just push the settings up a little bit and see how they go. So here's another example where I've applied pretty much the same technique, only not using a brush. I just applied a radial filter to this elephant. Now I could have brushed over it, but I felt like using a radial filter was easier in this scenario. So if we look at the before and the after, we can see that the elephant is so much sharper, so much more vibrant and contrasty. This has really made all the details on his skin look so much sharper. So this is a really easy trick. All you have to do is brush over yourself, brush over whatever is the subject of your photo, punch the sharpness and the clarity up just a little bit, and you can get some really, really cool results. Tip number 7, better waterfalls. Now again, this is one of those tips that I did teach in another tutorial, so you can go check that out if you want the detailed version. But the gist of it is, you can easily make your waterfalls more vibrant, more punchy by just brushing over them. So I'm just going to brush over this waterfall nice and easy here. There we go, just all over this area here where we've got water. I don't need to be too precise, I can just eyeball it, that's fine. And what I'm going to do is bring down the temperature because I want this waterfall to be nice and cold. There we go. Now this is too much. I have brought the temperature down, but it's got too much color, so I'm going to desaturate it a lot. There we go, somewhere around -90, just so I get a subtle blue tint. I'm going to punch the exposure up, maybe a stop and a half, something like that. I might pull the dehaze down just to get that sort of hazy feel to it. There we go. And I might pull the highlights down just slightly to avoid having some areas that are overblown. There we go, I feel like I could punch the exposure up a little bit more, something like that. Now this waterfall looks so much more vibrant, so much stronger than it was before. I might even punch it up just a little bit more. There we go, that looks so much better now. We've added so much to this image that wasn't there before. Now I'm just going to correct this actually because it's not as nice as I would have liked it. Missed a little bit on this waterfall around the top. And there you go, looks so much better than it did before. Tip number 8, lighting up bridges and pathways. Now, the focal point of this image is the bridge in the center, and it's already quite strong, quite vivid, but I want to punch it up just a tiny bit more. This really is a subtle touch. So I'm just going to paint over all of this bridge. There we go. I don't have to be too precise. Again, I can eyeball this and see how it goes, and then make some adjustments later. There we go. Reset the exposure. And I might just bring the exposure up just a tiny bit so it's a little bit brighter, and maybe punch the clarity up a bit. I just want this bridge to be really striking and contrasty. There we go, something like that I reckon looks absolutely perfect. Now here's another example. I wanted this pathway that I'm walking on to be the focal point of the image. I wanted it to be really bright, and because the overall image is quite bright, it does get drowned out. So I'm just gonna brush over this bridge right here and just make sure I make the brush smaller and smaller as I get further and further away. Something like that. There we go. Gonna reset the exposure. I might just punch the exposure up just a little bit, add some contrast so it's not too overblown, and maybe pull the shadows down just a little bit. There we go. I want this to be nice and bright, and I want it to contrast with the rest of the image as well. There we go, that looks really, really good. And this image, you could also apply a trick I showed you earlier on, which is painting over yourself and adding a little bit of sharpness so that you stand out a little bit better than you did before. Just make sure the subject is really clear and really sharp in the photo. Tip number 9, adding shadows. Now this is a trick you could do in Photoshop, probably a little bit easier using the dodge and burn tool, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you could do it straight in Lightroom. Now this photo right here originally was quite gray and quite desaturated, and I spent a lot of time replacing the sky and adding some sun to create a better atmosphere, because the truth of it is the day was quite rainy and quite gray, and the image didn't look like I wanted it to look. Now I've changed the sky, added some sunlight, some contrast, some color. It's already looking really good. The only issue is because the original photo was quite gray, there isn't a lot of shadows going on in this photo. Especially around these structures right here, there's no shadow, there's nothing going on, and it looks a little bit flat and unrealistic. So what we can do, I'm gonna reset the exposure on the brush, and I'm gonna pull the brush to -80 in the shadows, and I'm just gonna brush over some of these areas that should be darker. So if the sun is coming from the right, the areas that should be dark are on the left. There we go, I'm just slowly gonna brush over some of these sides. There we go, something like that. On all of these structures, just making sure to, there we go, paint around the sides, just adding loads of shadow to the sides where the sun wouldn't be hitting the structures, just to make it a little bit more realistic. Always a little bit of back and forth, just feathering this out. And there we go, that was really easy. So you could spend a little bit more time to make this perfect, but for the sake of this tutorial, this is a quick and easy version of it. Now, if we look at the before, the image looks quite flat, and you can tell that there's something weird going on. And the after, this looks so much better, so much more realistic, and it only took a couple of minutes of brushing around and playing around with the lights. Now again, you could do this in Photoshop using the dodge and burn tools, but there is a way of doing it straight in Lightroom if you don't have Photoshop, for example. And there you have it, guys, 9 creative ways of using the brush tool in Lightroom to dramatically enhance your photos. and really allow you to push the boundaries of what you thought you could do in Lightroom originally and be a little bit more creative. So that's it for the tutorial. I hope you found this useful. I hope you learned something new today. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It really helps me out. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you want to see next. I'll be making a bunch more tutorials in the weeks to come. And if you're new to the channel, my name is Mark. I'm a photographer, videographer, and I teach you all the things that I know. So make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. There's a lot more coming soon. And in the meantime, stay creative, guys. Take care.